We'll be posting the slides along with the recording for everybody to be able to review this. I found it really helpful in doing the summaries of the policy sessions to go back through the details. And so we'll have that available for folks at the Ontario for All website in our tools, on our tools page.
Now, Sean, I think I saw someone's hand go up just before you started to say about the recording, but I don't see the hand up now, so I'm not sure what happened.
Is there anybody else with a question?
Okay.
All right.
James, over to you.
Thank you, Gary. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how to connect with politicians, how to do the strategy behind advocacy, and some key takeaways on how to be maximally effective at this sort of thing. Off the bat, though, I mean, we don't need a civics lesson in all this. We all know about the orders of government, federal, provincial, municipal. That is one part of the equation. The other part of the equation, though, before you start talking about advocacy, is what are you trying to achieve? What are your objectives here? What is the specific thing or things that you're trying to get out of this engagement with government? And where does that power lie? In and of itself, that is a pretty difficult question to answer if you haven't been doing this for a long time. Not around the orders of government. We all know what the feds do versus the province and or the municipalities, but rather who in the machinery of government is actually best positioned to make the decision or have influence in the way that you need them to. So in every, let's just pick on, say, the provincial government. That's what Gary and I know particularly well. Within every ministry within the provincial government, yes, you've got your minister. Of course, you've got your minister, who is the political head of the ministry, the person in charge of the affairs of that ministry, charged with a mandate from the premier to execute the work under that ministry. But you also have a deputy minister, who is the most senior public servant within that ministry, that person would have more of the day-to-day control over the administration of the ministry, the stuff that keeps the job of government running and not necessarily the big questions of policy, changing X to Y or Y to Z. Within the minister's office, you would also have a chief of staff, who is the most senior political staff person working for that minister. Often that person is actually the gatekeeper that can get a lot done on your behalf and be a real ally for you because they have a window into everything else that's going on. Under that chief of staff, you would have policy staff, communications staff, stakeholder staff, etc., all of which are available, the titles and the names of which are available on publicly accessible websites, which we'll show on our slide deck later. But it is important to think through who actually needs to make the decision that I would like to get done. It doesn't always have to be the minister or the premier. And in fact, both the minister and the premier are the hardest to track down. Sometimes cultivating relationships with staff and getting to know the staff who work for the premier or the minister or the city councillor is actually very, very effective and can open the doors for you that you need. All of that said, though, as you think about issues to tackle, do of course keep in mind, am I talking to the right order of government? Is it federal? Is it provincial? Is it municipal? The lines are sometimes blurry these days around issues like COVID restrictions, for example, where the federal government funds a lot of stuff, the provincial government sets a lot of policy, and the municipal governments implement a lot of policy. But even within that, there's some blurriness there. So before you start, it is worth thinking through, am I talking to the right order of government? Am I talking to the right player in that order of government? And what is my strategy? What am I actually trying to achieve with this? And what are the steps necessary to execute the thing that I want to do? Next slide, please, Gary. Thank you. So you have to start with defining the problem. As I said, this is that strategy piece. Think to yourself very clearly, what is the specific problem that needs the intervention of government to solve? Is it a legislative barrier? Is it a regulatory barrier? Is it permission to do something? Or is it the removal of a prohibition on something? Is it new funding? Is it a new funding program? Lots of different things that could manifest this way, but you have to think pretty critically, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? That will ultimately guide your strategy and dictate what you do next. Because once you define your problem, you have to define the ask. So you know what the problem is, what needs to happen in order to solve that problem. Pass law X, amend law Z, change regulation A, fund program B, all of that sort of stuff. You need to think through, once you have the problem, how do we actually solve that problem, and what are the tools at the disposal of government to solve that problem on our behalf as a society. Which brings it to your third question, which I alluded to in the previous slide. Which order of government are you talking about? Is this a federal, municipal, or provincial issue? And thinking through the best place to go is a great next step, because again, that dictates who you actually talk to. And also, if you go back a step, dictates the interventions that are possible to solve your problem. Fourth is what other stakeholders can get involved. It is a common practice in not-for-profit advocacy to do some work as a collective, to reach out to partner organizations and get behind a common set of asks to have maximum impact. That's something that Gary and I are well versed in. We do this every day, both our two organizations working together, but also our two organizations working together with the rest of the developmental services system in Ontario to advance a key set of priorities. You get a lot farther together. It may take a bit longer to get there. You may have to water down your wine a little bit when you walk into the door, but certainly the power of numbers works for you if you've got a whole bunch of organizations marching in lockstep alongside you. Lastly, have the meeting and follow up. Be in regular contact with whoever you're talking to. Get to know them a little bit, cultivate a relationship. These are ultimately humans, after all. You know, governments in Canada are made up of people just like you and me who just have different jobs than we do. Their jobs are in government, ours are not, generally. And in addition to following up, you can ask them for advice. You know, if you get the sense that they're on board with you, you can ask pretty bluntly, okay, James, I know you like what we're doing. I know you can't get this done yourself, but what can we do as an organization to get this done? With your help. A gold mine for where to find all of these players that I've been talking about and Gary alluded to earlier is the Federal Employee Directory and the Provincial Employee Directory, both websites you'll find on your screen there. That is a repository of the names, titles, email addresses, and phone numbers for a lot of almost everybody in the provincial government and the federal government. It is largely up to date. Sometimes it's not, but it's certainly the best resource we have to know who's doing what job in the various parts of government. Next slide, please, Gary. Thank you. So as you think about who you're going to talk to, your odds are it's going to be in a meeting. So you're going to reach out to somebody, you'll find them in that list or those two directories there. You'll find who you want to talk to in a particular ministry or office. You'll reach out to them, you'll ask them for a meeting. For the purposes of today's conversation, let's assume they say yes. Sometimes they don't, sometimes they pass you off to somebody else. Other times they just don't respond. And in those cases, as Gary will tell you later, sometimes you have to ask 2, 3, 4 times, but that's okay. That's their job. Their job is to meet with you. Their job is to connect with people in the community that are doing important work in the purview on which they're working. But for the sake of this conversation, let's assume that they say yes. So the best thing you can do is do your homework. Prior to the meeting, you prepare your materials, get your briefing note together or your slide deck together, your letter together, whatever medium you think is best to get your point across in a quick, succinct, easy to understand way. Prepare your materials and then you share in advance. I cannot underscore this enough. Different people have different styles on this. I know even Gary and I have a different style on this. I like to share my stuff with the people I'm meeting with a couple of days in advance in case they have a moment to flip through what you're talking about before you meet with them. I'd say 8 out of 10 times, these are busy people. They won't have had a chance to read your material before you meet with them. But in the off chance, 2 out of 10 times, maybe over a coffee in the morning, they'll have flipped through your material and it makes for a different kind of meeting. It is also worth researching your participants. So Google them, Facebook them, Instagram them, check them out on LinkedIn, see where they've worked before, see if you have any friends in common or any interests in common that are out there. You may not necessarily want to lead with, hey, I looked you up on Facebook last night and you like the Toronto Maple Leafs. You probably wouldn't want to lead with that, but that's something you can know at the back of your head. And maybe if you're trying to spark a connection during the meeting, you can mention a common interest in, say, in this case, in beliefs. If you're bringing other people with you, which is a good practice. So when I do meetings for Community Living Toronto, and I know when Gary does meetings for Reena, we typically like to bring along a family member of somebody who's in service or somebody who's in service with us. They tell their stories far better than we could, and it's much more impactful when they do. But for anybody else who's in your meeting, it is worth taking a minute or two to just brief them on the message. So we've got half an hour with Minister X. We need to get through points 1 and 2 and leave plenty of time for questions. Here's the kind of thing we can talk to. Here's the kind of thing we shouldn't talk about during the meeting, and just get on the same page before you walk in, be it virtual or in real life. And then lastly, it is worth your time to confirm the meeting. As I said earlier, the people you're meeting with tend to be very busy with lots going on. Sometimes they're double booked. Sometimes they're triple or quadruple booked. It is worth checking in with them the day of your meeting or the night before, just to make sure that the time you've booked still works. During the meeting itself, be sure to keep your discussion focused. So bring a set list of issues forward, preferably with some backup materials. I would say no more than 2 or 3 issues, depending on how complex they are. But you need to assume that when you're meeting with somebody in government, you are one meeting in a day full of meetings. They have gone through a whole bunch of different issues that day. They've been working on 50 different things. Their mind is all over the place. So as much as possible to be succinct, to be focused, and give them a précis of your issue, but no more than 2 or 3 issues. And leave plenty of time for questions. The Socratic method is very useful in talking to elected officials and their staff, because then you can get a sense of where they're coming from. Maybe they know more about this already, or maybe even more than you do, if they've got a personal connection or they worked in your field prior to getting into government, that kind of thing. So leave lots of time for questions, and always end with the photo for social media. Whether you're doing it in real life or over Zoom or Teams, etc., it's very simple. Just, at the end of the meeting, thank you, Gary, for your time today. Can we do a quick picture to put up on Twitter? I've never met a politician who says no to taking a picture. The important thing is you take the picture, you tweet it out with a little message, a little tweet or something, and you tag them in it as well, so that they can then retweet and share around their networks as well. And after the meeting, always follow up with a thank you, and follow up and respond to any questions that came up during the meeting that you might not have had answers to in the moment. And that really is how you cultivate the relationship. I'll say one more time that these are human beings doing complex jobs in a complex system. This business is based on relationships and getting to know people and having a connection to people. So if they ask you a question during the meeting that you don't have answers to, maybe they need that fact in order to make their argument to their boss the next day or a couple of weeks later. So genuinely respond, thank you. By the way, you asked about this. Here's the response I was able to find for you. Please let me know if you need anything else. And you'd be surprised how often that turns into a proper back and forth type relationship with somebody working in government.
So thank you. So just before, Sean, we get back to some questions, let me reiterate a couple of points. Back on the first slide, when we were discussing the different orders of government, I've worked for many charities and nonprofits in my life, both as an employee and as a consultant. And I was amazed when I walked into one smaller charity, and I said, well, who's your counselor? Who's your MP? Who's your MPP? And their response was, I don't have a clue. Why would I want to know? All they're going to do is want to be invited to my gala and want a free meal. And I was absolutely aghast. And I said, no, that's not how this works. So went and had a meeting, in this case, met with the MP first, just called up the MP and said, I've just started with this charity. Not sure if you know us. I'd like to introduce you and tell you all the work that we do. Next thing I know, the MP says, well, you know what? I'm sending out a householder, when they used to do the householders across the riding, and I always like to profile a charity or nonprofit. You happen to walk in at just the right time. Can you please get me 500 words on the work that you do? And it's going to go around to every constituent in the riding, which was absolutely perfect, and you never know where things go from there. So please always make sure at at the minimal, at the absolute minimum, that you know who your representatives are and they know you. And the other very important part to James is know what your ask is. To walk in and say, help me, no one's going to be happy, because no matter what they help you with, it'll never be enough. But if you have and they won't know how to help you unless you have some specifics in terms of how and what you need the help. So Sean, let me turn it over to you in case there's some questions.
Right. Well, we've covered a lot of ground here, and so I imagine people will want to see some unpacking of some of these items. I don't see any hands or anything in the chat just yet, but does anybody have a question? If you want to raise your hand in on video as well, we can connect you in. While we're waiting on people for that, I was struck, Gary, when you were talking about people saying, oh my goodness, they'll just want to come to our gala and get a free meal. Because the advice I always give people is invite them to your gala and give them a free meal.
100%, you want them there.
Yeah, as James said, this world is based on relationships, and if you've established the relationship before you're making an ask, that certainly never does you any harm. If the only relationship you have is one where you're asking them for things, well, again, politicians are people too, so that's a particular kind of relationship and not maybe the most fruitful one. But Paul, you've been around this block a few times. What, do you have a question?
I'm going to take that as kindness. James, when you were outlining the levels of government and sort of thinking about like who you need to talk to, it occurred to me that, and this happens in the advocacy work that we do as a network organization, but for others also, any particular best practices around multi-level advocacy? And I'm thinking, for example, of lobbying municipal representatives to in turn lobby provincially on, over an issue. And this would happen over housing. This would happen over actually, any number of things, where you might want your, ward councillor or the mayor to lobby the provincial or federal government on an issue. Best practices around that sort of thing. That's where, in my experience, that's where we have the closest relationships. So how do you not compromise those relationships by, or how do you maximize the opportunity to maintain the relationship and have them do some of that work with you?
Yeah, Paul, that's an excellent question, and actually something that Gary and I are grappling with together currently on housing, actually. So I would say, so a couple of things is, you're right, a lot of issues, especially more complex issues, do require an interaction with more than one order of government. That's the nature of the beast. There's nothing wrong with that. But it is worth upfront taking some time to dissect your problem clearly into what is the municipality's role in this, what is the feds, what are the province, what are the different components of your problem that the different orders of government interact with, and one step below that, what piece of provincial legislation or what municipal, say, zoning process are we talking about, and how does that fit in with, say, the provincial official plan process and stuff like that. So if it's more than one order of government, you really have to think through the chain reaction that goes from, intervention A leads to B, leads to C, all the way up the chain. So that's point one. Point two is, if the specific ask you're bringing to the table is, City Councilor X, please work with the province to accomplish this particular outcome, or work to ask the province to achieve this particular outcome, make it as easy as possible for them. To the level of write the letter for them. Get them the email address the letter has to go to, at least the formality. They may have their own channel to get a letter into, but if you can make it so easy that they just have to nod and give it to their staffer, and then their staffer takes your letter, affixes the member or the councillor's signature to it and hits send, it's much more likely to actually happen than if you're asking them to please write a letter to the premier about X, Y, and Z. Though that's what comes to mind for me. Gary, anything I missed?
I was just going to say basically the same thing. And there's also nothing wrong, particularly when you have the relationship with the lower tier, any of the tiers of government, of saying, this is my problem, this is my solution, but you know what? I'm not really that familiar with exactly where I should be going here, there, or everywhere. They will give you the direction. And when we get to the case study in a minute, you'll see exactly how we did that with the former premier and how she made housing go national. So more on that in a second.
That's super helpful. Thank you.
If I can chip in one last thing, which is know the what's in it for me, the answer to the what's in it for me question. Municipalities often, when they do advocacy, are going to weigh, is this something where I'm using my clout to give something to somebody else, or am I using my clout to get something that's good both for somebody else and for me? If it's, you know, to build some affordable housing in your neighborhood, it's going to be good for your affordable housing provider. It's also going to be good for the neighborhood. And so the being able to build in that to the ask is helpful.
Good
So I've
point,
got a
Sean.
bunch of hands up. I have Joyce and then Narissa and then Susan. So I'm just going to go to Joyce next.
Thanks, but I think Narissa had her hand up first.
Okay, Narissa, are you ready? It looks like you're in transit right now. So maybe
I'm
do
here.
you want to go now or do you want Joyce to go first?
No, I'm here. I'm good.
Okay.
I'm here.
All right, go ahead.
I have a question for you. So if you've written the federal government and you've gotten a response, and then you've written the and then there was then the letter was sent to somebody else in the federal government around that piece of legislation that you're trying to pass, and then they're referring you to somebody else. Is that how it works? Is it like a chain? Is it like a chain thing where you gotta keep doing these emails?
Yeah, absolutely. Never take everybody's phone call, thank them profusely, find out who to talk to next and who to talk
Right.
to next. And I will tell you from fact, it absolutely works. When I was working with another small not-for-profit, I was harping on one particular thing and they were passing me from person to person to person, getting more and more frustrated until all of a sudden someone answered the phone and said, "Oh, this is great. It's almost year end. I've got money left in my budget. This program looks fantastic. How long before you can have a proposal on my desk?" Trust me, the proposal was on that person's desk in 24 hours. And yeah, so it's very often you'll get passed from person to person. You may want to speak with, to James's initial comment, you may want to speak with the minister and only the minister. And I mean, this happened to me as well. And then you walk into the door because you couldn't meet with the minister, you're meeting with the staff person. And then you find out that that's the most junior staff person in the office who started the week before and could barely pronounce the minister's name or know what they were talking about, but take it as a serious meeting because that led to something else, that led to something else, that led to the National Housing Strategy assisting those with developmental disabilities. So absolutely, you take the meetings, you say thank you, and you ask what's next.
And Narissa, the only thing I'd add to that is, in your case, and more generally speaking, if you're being passed not just within a ministry, like from branch to branch to branch, but rather from ministry to ministry to ministry within the government, the other thing worth doing is going on that directory website and finding one or two staff in each of those offices, in each of those ministers' offices, and telling them that hi, I'm Narissa, I'm so-and-so, I submitted this letter, I've got this issue, I'd love to tell you about it. Oh, and by the way, I've also been directed to your colleague somewhere else. And that it is worth talking to each of them along the way, as Gary said, whether that's true within a ministry or across different ministries within the same government.
Thank you
I
so
can
much.
just-
That was very helpful.
If I can just reinforce something James said earlier on, one of the key tasks, aside from knowing exactly what you want, is knowing exactly who can give it to you. And so the people who are passing you along are really doing you a favor. They are helping you find the answer to that important second question, which is, who is it that I talk to that I can get this from? So Joyce, we have you up next.
So what do you do when you know who you should be talking to and who has the ability to make change, but they keep throwing you down to the lowest possible person, and it continues to be that person, and the answer is always no, and they don't have the authority to do what you need to do. And so you've tried everything you can, you've gone through all the people that you might be able to go to. What do you do when there's just this no? And I find that this is the first government that I have dealt with that has done that constantly. It's just throw you down to the lowest person who can't do anything.
So James and I
Yes.
may have different answers on this one, but mine is persistence generally pays. Keep on speaking with the lower level person and making sure that they understand that they have the ability to change the world, and that the working with you together, they're going to change the world. At the same time that may or may not work, you have to figure out a few other side angles to get to that person at the top, which may mean going above them. And you can't, pardon my French, piss them off any more than they already are, because they're not seeing you. So if you're able to connect with someone either at their level or at a bit higher level to say, I've been trying to meet with this person unsuccessfully for quite some time, can you help me? And sometimes this may also come to play with different orders of government. If you're in good with one level and need to get to the other, maybe they can help you. But James has been in this exact position with his previous job, so he's probably got the better answers.
Not surprisingly, Gary covered almost all of what I was going to say, actually. But the only thing I'd add to that is that in terms of the other creative ways to get at somebody, another way to do it, it's trickier now, frankly, than it was pre-COVID, but people go to events, right? Like ministers go through communities, or deputy ministers, associate ministers go through communities. Sometimes it is worth, Minister Joe Schmo is going to your local barbecue nearby. Sometimes it is worth schlepping over to that barbecue and actually talking to them in real life, because then they're putting a face to a name. And whether that's the person you're trying to talk to, or it's that person's junior staffer who you've been talking to, suddenly now you've met the minister and you can say, yeah, I've been trying to get a meeting with Gary, but he's not getting back to me. And like Gary said, it may feel weird to do that, because in a way you're throwing them under the bus, but that's their job. And the ministers will want to hear if that part of their operation isn't working, right? Like in my experience, I have more trouble with staff than I do with ministers. If you get to a minister, they are ultimately politicians and they want to get things done. We may not always agree with what they're trying to get done, but they're trying to move things along, whereas the staffers tend to play more of a gatekeeper role in keeping problems off of a minister's desk. So if you have an opportunity to do that, it takes a bit more work, but it is worth trying to do, in addition to the persistence that Gary is talking to. Joyce, I'm sure that's an unsatisfactory answer, but that's certainly the best answer I can.
I tried all of that. Everything that you've said, I tried, got absolutely nowhere.
Sorry to hear that. Then I'll say, make sure you vote.
I was just going to say, you use your voice, and that's the vote you have. Absolutely.
And sorry, one more thing is, sorry, Sean, is social media. If all else fails and you feel like you're not getting anywhere with letters or in real life, it is shocking how many results you can get by a bit of a spicy tweet, tagging the right person.
Thanks.
Thank you.
The one other thing I'll add in, just as a slightly hopeful note, is if there's something I'm trying to move and I can't budget, both in the real world and in the political world, I find a friend to help me out. And who is it that that might be able to break through where you weren't able to break through, who has a relationship or has something that can leverage that other opportunity. All right, let's go to Susan. You have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm not camera ready today. I'm with the Space Coalition, which is saving public access to community space everywhere. And we have been working for 20 years on the issue of community groups using space in schools. We go back and forth, like it's such a meta issue that, we don't really have individual stakeholders in our membership. We have, the heads of organizations and the heads of associations. We go back and forth on whether we should be focusing on getting research data or getting stories. And I just wanted to get your input on that.
You need them both. You need the stories, right? So you need the stories to twig people. You need the stories to, quote unquote, make people cry as you're speaking with them, to know that they have the power to change and they must do. but you also need some sort of data to prove that what I'm talking about is real, makes a difference. And it doesn't have to be like real sophisticated $1 million research projects, because government understands you don't have the wherewithal to do that type of stuff. But just whatever small pieces of data that you can have of changes, even if it's a matter of surveying some of the groups that have used space and community space, what difference it's made, some of the participants that changed. Choose one story of how someone's life was changed because they went to a program, any program, through one of your members that was held in a community school. And had it not been there, it wouldn't have happened, and who knows what would have happened with that person.
So yeah, I agree with Gary there. You need both, because depending on who you're talking to, they may be the type that is more swayed by data, whereas the person down the hall that you're talking to next may be more swayed by stories. It varies a lot, person to person, and office to office, and ministry to ministry, and et cetera, et cetera. But where you get to the sweet spot is where, like Gary said, the one informs the other, and the story backs up the point you're trying to make with the data. That's the sweet spot, because then you're making the same point and using two different media, and that can be very, very effective. So you do need both.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
And that is the last hand we had up. So I am going to hand it back to James and Gary to go to the next slides.
So this is going to be a case study about Reena. And here we have Reena's mission statement, a nonprofit organization that promotes dignity, individuality, independence, personal growth, and community inclusion for people with diverse abilities within a framework of Jewish culture and values, obviously open and accessible to everybody. Well, I started with Reena about 6 years ago now, and there was a really big issue about housing, and housing for those with developmental disabilities. There was a 40-year wait list, and unfortunately it's a little better, but not much, with supports for those with developmental disabilities. Over 18% of people who are homeless have a developmental disability. 90% of adults with developmental disabilities live below the poverty line. And women with developmental disabilities are 65% more likely to experience abuse. And I can go on with a number of those stats. And a lot of that can be, quote unquote, made better with appropriate housing in place. So we started on the mission to improve housing, and we really weren't sure how and where we were starting or what, but we knew that Reena couldn't do it alone. We were a sector leader in many areas, but this was way bigger than Reena. The provincial government had recognized this as an issue from the Ombudsman's report from a couple of years prior. The federal government, the Liberal government under Prime Minister Trudeau, had just gotten in, and they had said on more than one occasion that housing was a priority. And we decided that we needed to get the attention of the federal government, and housing would magically appear. And that was what we started with in April 2016. We knew what the problem was. We knew we wanted the solution of more housing, and we figured it was all federal. But now we needed the strategy and how and what to do and how to get there. So we determined a specific and reasonable ask. People were still dealing with fiscal restraint, and we were afraid to ask for any new money. So all that we said is, whatever you spend on housing, we want 5%. And this became known at the time as the 5% ask. We're not asking for new money. We're just asking whatever you're going to spend, 5%, a very clear ask. But wait a minute, it has to be more than just Reena. So we formed a group of charities and nonprofits together who were interested in the same thing, to improve housing for those with developmental disabilities. And we started out with 6 charities and nonprofits, not all of whom were in the developmental services sector. There was a church who wanted to build and knew that this was a vulnerable community that needed help. And we got people in from our sector association, from Oasis, from people who knew people who knew people. And we started with 6 individuals, and we ended up, now we're well over 2 dozen, and more than just Ontario. We then started to host information sessions with sector leaders within developmental services to get their buy-in. They may or may not have been members of the Intentional Community Consortium, but we wanted to make sure they were on side and they knew what we were doing, because if government were to ask anyone in developmental disabilities, you think this is a good thing, you think this is a bad thing, whether or not it was something that they were working on right then as their priority, we wanted them to respond, oh yes, that's good. If that would come, that would be wonderful. Because everybody knows everybody, and you never know who's going to talk to who and what's going to happen where. So then to get the ball rolling, slightly different order here, we hosted a forum with the Pearson Center and a few members of Parliament. So the Pearson Center was a public policy think tank. And we spoke with them. It so happened I knew the executive director, but that wasn't so important. I outlined the problem to them. I outlined what a possible solution was. And I said, we want to hold a forum. We want to hold a think tank on it. And lo and behold, they agreed. Then using them, we got some members of Parliament involved. And because of our local connections, our local member of Parliament got involved as well. And that was really the kickoff, because I'll never forget that Adam Vaughan came because of the Pearson Center. And that was, he was not the Parliamentary Secretary for Housing yet, but he was certainly very involved in housing from the get-go. And he came and stayed with us and had discussions. We were able to take him on a tour, be part of the forum, and hear what was happening. We then knocked on doors relentlessly at Ottawa and Queen's Park, and we never went just ourselves. We were always there with another organization to show that we had more strength than just us. We always either had a board member, a family member, an individual with us, and as James said, their stories are much better. The politicians see people like me and now James 24/7. They don't always see the board members. They don't always see the individuals. And that's what makes the difference. Here you'll note that the only ask we had was for the sector. We never said Reena, Reena, Reena. We said housing for developmental disabilities across the country or the province, depending on who we were talking to. And I'll never forget, there was one particular meeting we had in Ottawa with a senior staff person in Minister Duclos' office, who at the time was Minister of Children, Family and Child Services, responsible for housing and the CMHC. And he said, okay, so I understand you're here and I understand what you're asking for, but what does Reena want? And myself and my boss, Brian Keshen, the CEO of Reena, said very plainly, we want 5% of all new housing dollars to support those with developmental disabilities so they can have the appropriate supportive housing in place. And he says, no, what does Reena want? What does Reena want? And finally, in exasperation, I said, okay, Reena today wants nothing. But trust me, the minute you give the 5% and the minute there is a program to apply for that 5%, Reena will be knocking on your door for that. But that's not today's discussion. That's tomorrow's discussion once we get through today's discussion. Couldn't believe, said we're the only people that had come to him without a direct ask. And it was then suggested that we build a national profile. And I'm thinking, okay, like we're Reena. Yeah, we pretend we're big. We're not that big. We don't have extra money. How am I supposed to go across the country? What am I supposed to do to build a national profile? Well, there happened to be a granting program that I had applied for some other stuff that we got the grant. And I checked, you know what? Could we change it a little bit to find out, as we were building our second intentional community, the Loof Rubin Reena residents, could we do some research work on what others are doing across the country to make sure we're doing what's best for the individuals we support? And fortunately, the granting body said, yes, not a problem, worked out very nicely. And we had a forum in Calgary, Edmonton, and went out to the BC nonprofit home show. And we built up the profile that we needed. The other thing that we did in terms of the national profile, And James, I'll thank you personally right now in front of everybody. We had an event of an opening, and again, why do you want politicians there? We were opening up a new group home. It so happened it was in Richmond Hill. It so happened it was a few blocks away from where the Premier Wynne grew up. So we decided we would see what we could do and see about inviting the Premier, and lo and behold, the Premier came to the opening. Then pulled her aside after the opening, explained in tremendous detail about our ask. And she says, oh, I have a meeting coming up with the Federation of Premiers from Council of Federations, which is the premiers from across the country. James, help Gary do the write-up. I want something. And lo and behold, she spoke with it at the Federation's meeting. And all of a sudden it grew with a national profile. Well, what's the result? Well, thank God when the National Housing Strategy was released in November 2017, I still remember flipping on the briefing note and seeing at least 2,400 units for those with developmental disabilities. Unbelievable, we have a start. Before that, after many meetings with CMHC, they called Reena and the ICC for data because they didn't have enough and they were trying to justify. So because we had gained credibility with them, they called us. CMHC worked with Reena and the ICC to roll out the program. We're now in a position to be building new affordable housing. You see behind me the Lou Fruitman Reena residence. We're now starting, there's an application in for a third in Toronto, and Councillor Mike Cole has been tremendously supportive. When the National Dementia Strategy came out, we heard they were starting to talk about it. Well, as some of you may know, those with intellectual and developmental disabilities as they age are almost guaranteed to get dementia at a much earlier age. We need it in. Well, because of all the contacts that we had before from housing, we were able to meet with the people writing the strategy pretty quickly, and we got in there, which has opened up hopefully some future funding. Lou Fruitman Reena residence is now open, as I said, and across the country as of December 2020, the new numbers aren't out yet, 650 units for those with developmental disabilities have been built across the country. Now, it's not solving the problem, but it's a lot better than it was the year before. And it's continuing to build and expand. And with that, let's stop for those specific questions and then open it up in general. And I will tell you, to James's point, this is exactly how James and I met. And I will never forget the day both James provincially and federally, the individual from Minister Duclos' office I was dealing with, had told me we had done everything we needed to do. We should wait for the budget. And the provincial budget came and there was no mention. And the federal budget came, or the other way, and there was no mention. And I went down to see James, and to say that I was hot under the collar, politely but nicely, would be an understatement. And to the earlier point of which level of government, well, this was the case that both levels of government were directly involved and they both had to do. And I figured the only thing I could do was to get them both in a room together. And I said, well, you guys come in a room together because I'm tired of playing one off against the other and nothing's happening. Well, lo and behold, they did, we did, and the rest is history. Questions? Sean, back to you.
Thank you. I'm seeing cheering in the chat, but no questions in the chat. But that's a robust example of many of the components of the process of getting governments to do the things that we want them to do. And I'm wondering if folks have things that they want to unpack or explore in that process.
Hello. I'm noticing so far, just as I'm navigating kind of what the housing scene is looking like, it seems to be for people that are on disability, they have to be over 18, like they have to be an adult. So a lot of the housing, they have to be an adult. Is there any kind of housing that's for children that's under 18? That's kind of
absolutely. Yeah, there are many. So the whole thing behind our ask was we just wanted housing for those with developmental disabilities. We never specified what type of housing. We never specified what age of housing, because age of individuals, because different organizations support different ages, types, etc. And we just wanted more because the need was so great. So there are many agencies. It just so happens that Reena doesn't do that much with youth. James, do you want to some answers? But there's group homes, there's placements with families, placements with foster families, there's everything.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. There certainly are options out there on the children's side, or at least under 18. Typically, though, the trick there is it is pretty important to be connected to, in our case, to the developmental services system already prior to needing support. For if you're talking about a kid, it's much easier for somebody under 18 to get support within a residential setting if they're already connected to the developmental services system through your local DSO. For example, Developmental Services Ontario office. That's in the developmental services space. I'll say I don't know too much about accessing housing, especially government assisted housing for folks under 18 outside of developmental services. If you're in Toronto, I would say the best place to start would be to call your counselor, and failing that, calling TCHC as well, to at least get some answers. That's certainly the approach that I would take.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
And other questions? Gary, you were so clear and compelling. We all know exactly what to do now as we move forward to move governments in the right direction.
But remember to make friends with the politicians at every level. Invite them out to your events, ask them to give greetings, ask them to invite you to events and things that they're having. You never know who you're going to meet and where it's going to lead.
And if I could add one thing to that, Sean, we are an interesting time in the provincial electoral calendar. So the writs of election are going to be issued next week. The campaign will start, and election day is June 2nd. I know it's a lot to ask, but in the pursuit of cultivating those relationships, as Gary was saying a moment ago, it is worth your time, if you're advocating for something, to go out there and meet the candidates who are running in the ridings that you're operating in or that you're interested in. It is worth meeting not just with the sitting member, but any candidate who you think might have a chance to secure that seat. If you like what they're saying, it might even be worth taking off your professional hat and in your personal time going out and knocking on some doors with them and getting involved in their campaign. I am in no way advocating for any particular party or riding or anything like that. Purely the idea of civic involvement during a campaign, both for the purposes of getting to know your candidates and getting to know eventually your members, but also because it's a good exercise in democracy to get to know how the system works and to sort of flex those civics muscles a little bit, which you don't get to do too often. That's certainly something that I'll be doing with myself this weekend.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Now, someone has posted messages in the chat privately to me asking, well, if it's only 650 out of the 2,400 units, is advocacy still needed? Is that a slow pace, etc.? Well, it takes a little bit of time to get the gears running, but we wanted it to be faster. So I must tell you that James and I and many others have spent the majority of the past year advocating at the provincial level to say, thank you very much, federal government. You have done incredible work by putting those with developmental disabilities into the National Housing Strategy. Province, we have an issue. Not every municipality across Ontario believes the same, and not all of them are giving priority to those most vulnerable community. We need your help. And we have spoken with many ministries, many ministers, many staff with a concrete proposal on what they could do. Unfortunately, it came to pass that it hasn't happened yet. Maybe it will in the future. But no, the advocacy is absolutely continuing on a regular basis. And until such time as there is no longer a massive waiting list, it will continue. Anyone wants to join and come on board? Gladstone@reena.org contact information. I guess I stopped sharing too soon. I'll put it back up and to the final slide that has our contact information.
We'll also be putting that on the website, and just to link those last two interventions together, you know, 2 lessons you can learn about this work is it is really never too early to start. Getting to know the candidate, the you know, Minister of Community and Social Services when she's still, you know, a candidate who's never held public office down in her riding is a handy thing to have done. And it's also, you know, always too early to finish. If you have the legislation and you have the item in the budget and all the deals are done, follow through until you see the dollars get spent and the shovels in the ground. There is no point at which the advocacy should stop until you have all of the things you need already taken care of.
And never, ever forget to say thank you publicly and loudly when any elected member has done anything that you have asked them to do or has had any impact on getting success for you. Remember to say thank you and let other people know.
The only thing I'll add to that is I'm an optimist by nature. I have to be or else I'll go crazy. And for those of us who do particularly social policy, government relations and advocacy stuff, you have to remain optimistic because it takes a lot of work, and we would love to solve all the world's problems, and we live the world's problems in our everyday lives professionally as well as potentially personally every day, and work so much closer to the realities of that every day. I believe, and I feel like I have to believe, that the old saying that the long arc of history tends towards progress. So we're not going to house everybody this year. I would that we could, I wish that we could, but it's not going to happen. But every incremental investment that houses another 200 people, another 300 people, 400 people next year, like it does make a difference. Unfortunately, not for everybody, but it does make a difference over time to keep stacking those accomplishments on top of each other and making the world a better place. Maybe I'm too optimistic and too naive about this, but that's certainly what helps get me through the day. Oh, you're muted, Sean.
Yeah, not seeing any other questions. With that, I am going to thank James and Gary for just a fantastic run through the 101s of doing this work. I want to remind people that the video and the PowerPoint presentation will shortly be up on our site, ontarioforall.ca, on the tools and resources page, along with all of the videos that are already up there from the 5 policy forums that were carried out in March, and more videos to come from a variety of sources to try and make sure that we're continuing to provide to you the tools and information and skills to craft your message and deliver it to making sure that we get better public policy and that the experiences of folks on the front lines are reflected in the public policy we see. If you go to our tools and resources page and you don't see something that you need, please let us know. We will look for where there's a nonprofit that's developed this already and share it on our page. And if nobody's done it, we'll figure out a way to get it made, because our job is to make sure that it's easier for you to do your job of helping to shape public policy. So thanks to both of you. Thanks to all the participants, and have a pleasant weekend.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Great to talk to you. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.